Autumn 1944. The ship's hull groaned like an old cathedral as it shouldered through the cold Atlantic dawn, and Franz Bacher, Austrian-born 24 art student turned private in Feldgrau, counted the rivets on the steel seam beside his bunk as if they were beads of a secular rosary. Counting calmed the mind. 26 to the elbow, 13 to the knee, 8 to the floor. He had learned long ago that numbers obeyed when nothing else did. When the Liberty ship angled in toward the American coast, he stood at the rail between two men from Cologne and let the smell of land, wet wood and coal, and a faint sweet of grain flood the spaces war had hollowed out. Norfolk had been noise and cranes and a forest of masts. Rails clanged, men shouted in English that sounded like boots on ice, and somewhere a siren went on being a siren because no one had told it the war would end. They processed the prisoners with a rhythm that felt drilled into the concrete: line up, photograph, tag, a clipped lecture in accurate German about the Geneva rules and what they meant exactly here, not as rumour, but as procedure. Then trains, days of rails rolling out beneath their feet like the world's most confident sentence. Franz pressed his forehead to the cool of a Pullman window and watched the night clarities multiply. Towns lit as if someone had spilled electricity and let it run. He knew blackout. He knew curtains pinned to keep kindness from leaking. This, street lamps stepping down a hill, a filling station blazing at midnight, a woman in a kitchen washing dishes with a radio on and her window bare, was not knowledge. It was contradiction. Maine arrived as a sudden quiet. Frost at the ditch edges like a silver cuff. The train emptied into trucks, the trucks took the perimeter road, and Houlton Army Air Base revealed itself in pieces. Runway first, black and absolute, hangars with their mouths open to weather, then barracks, new boards still smelling of sap, thrown up in lines careful enough to satisfy a draftsman. The place wore two faces at once, airfield and camp, like a coin just beginning to be spent. Guard towers squared the corners. Wire divided the world with tidy certainty. Camp Houlton, the sergeant at the gate said, as if christening it. The men filed into an intake hut warmed by a potbelly stove whose breath was iron and old ash. Franz held the paperwork the way one holds a fragile package, both hands, not squeezing. A clerk with Maine vowels pronounced his name slowly, Bacher, and wrote it perfectly on a card. The card became a number. The number became a bunk. The bunk became a place in the world that was not moving. The first shock did not come from the wire or the guard rifles or the list of rules tacked with officious neatness to a board. It came from the light switch. The bulb over the barracks centre beam blinked, steadied, and flooded the room without apology. He looked at the filament as if it were a living thing. He had not seen light used this casually since the 30s. Then came heat, the stove throwing a steady democratic warmth that did not play politics with rank. Then came plenty, the modest American kind that accumulates by counting correctly. Tin plates filled with stew, whose fat held a shine, coffee that was coffee, white bread soft enough to insult a European, jam in a cracked bowl, and, on the table beside the salt, a tin of sugar, as if the word ration were a rumour, not a law. He ate his bowl empty and watched everyone else pretend this was normal. The guards pretended. The stewards pretended. Even some of the prisoners pretended, as a way to keep from thinking too fast. Franz considered the sugar tin the way a painter considers a light source, where it fell, what it made true or false, how it changed the angles of a room. He did not take any. Not yet. He wanted to earn the right to take American sweetness with an American gesture. After chow, they learned the arithmetic of captivity in a republic. Work was voluntary. The camp partnered with local farm bureaus, potatoes in the fall, peas in the spring, woods work when the roads froze hard as iron. 8 hours outside the wire earned 80 cents a day, not in currency but in camp scrip, rectangular chits printed with the moral of the system. value contained, temptation diverted, dignity paid. The scrip could be spent at the PX on cigarettes, chocolate, stationery, soap, sometimes beer if a shipment came through. No hoarding, no trade with civilians, no leaving the path between truck and field. He wrote it down on the back of the intake card like a draftsman noting dimensions. 8 hours equals $0.8 equals coffee plus paper plus pencil. It was the first equation in years that promised more than it threatened. They issued blankets, a pillow thin as a lie, and 2 sheets that smelled of the laundry more than of the last body that had used them. Franz lay on his back and stared at the seam where the ceiling planks met. A knot pattern emerged, and his hand twitched with the need for a pencil. He had painted Vienna in oils with a cheap courage that only cities can provoke. Now he wanted to draw a roof beam in pencil with the kind of honesty that knows where weight goes. In the morning, the guard at the catwalk stamped his boots and blew steam into the blue. The barracks woke together, a rustle like a field when wind changes its mind. They lined up outside the PX to learn its rules. No cash, no credit. 1 carton a week, 2 bars a day, paper when in stock, envelopes when the truck came up from Boston, razor blades when God smiled. The prices were printed at eye level, 5 cents translating directly into a prisoner's imagination. If 80 cents buys 16 nickels, and a nickel buys a Coca-Cola or a candy bar or 2 postcards, then one day's sweat becomes a letter, and a sweetness, and a thing with bubbles in it that tastes like forgetting. He did the math as if he were laying out a facade. Proportions must please the mind. The clerk slid him a pencil from a chipped jar and an 8-page pad that said Eagle across the top in a font that pretended to be victory. He paid in scrip that looked like something a stage would use to tell a story about money. Work details posted on a bulletin board in a narrow handwriting he admired. Potato harvest, Aroostook County, 0800 trucks, gloves recommended. Maine learned to say Aroostook with a mouthful of winter. Franz learned to say it at all. A corporal with a face carved out of August explained the barrel count, the pay slab, the lunch arrangement. "We don't starve men here," he said, not kindly, not unkindly, simply citing policy. The wire, which had seemed the principal fact on arrival, diminished as other lines asserted themselves. Rows of barracks, rows of bunks, rows of potatoes in a field visible between barrack corners, rows of figures in a ledger that told the quartermaster how much flour to order for Tuesday. It is one thing to be fenced in by barbed wire. It is another, subtler thing to be contained by the predictability of schedules that keep arriving on time. Franz recognized the sensation from studios, when the canvas finally begins to dictate to the hand, not the other way around. Camp life, well run, can be a kind of composition. He walked the yard the way a surveyor walks a lot. A runway cut the sky with the authority of a T-square. Old stories rode the wind, the pre-war days when neutrality kept pilots from flying new American planes into Canada, the solution as Yankee as a handplane. Hitch them to tractors and tow the machines across the border on wheels, law satisfied, ocean bridged by stubbornness and rope. He could see it, wings shouldered by ice, the long hiss of tires on packed snow, a farmer's cap pulled low, laughter like steam hanging and breaking. It was a small story, but it hooked itself to larger ones he had only begun to believe. That night, when lights went out not by decree but by switch, he wrote a letter on the eagle pad and tried to say something true without making the censor's pencil break. He wrote about the weather first. Weather passes. He wrote about work, carefully. Work redeems. He did not write about sugar. He did not write about the bulb. He did not write the thought that had visited him in the PX when the clerk counted his scrip with the deliberation of a priest, that he, a prisoner, possessed more choice in 10 minutes of American retail than he had in a year of uniforms. Sleep came with the clean exhaustion of counted things. He had counted rivets at sea, counted towers by rail, counted bulbs along a runway, counted items on a menu he did not yet dare to order, counted nickels in the theatre of his mind. In a day or two he would count barrels smartly stacked in a truck bed and learn the theology of potatoes, where labour translated without loss into heat and food and a nickel soda in the hand. For now he counted breaths and let his hand rest, fingers slightly curled, as if holding a brush the future would return. In the weeks ahead, fields would matter more than fences. Rows would tame his temper and give his back a name. The barracks would settle into their own gravity and keep him from floating too far into memory. The arithmetic of 80-cent days would teach him which pleasures were not betrayals. And Maine, the word like a fist unclenching, would give him a sky to measure against anything he had been told. He crossed an ocean to arrive at edges, of a continent, of a camp, of himself. The rest of the map would draw itself in potatoes and pencils, scrip and light bulbs, runways and rules, a geometry that, for the first time in years, added up. The first frost of October found the prisoners ankle-deep in soil that broke apart like stale bread. Franz Bacher bent to the rhythm of it, his gloved hands pulling potatoes from earth that steamed faintly when split open. In Vienna he had known studios with plaster casts and brushes lined like soldiers on a shelf. Here in Aroostook County, Maine, his still life came directly from the ground. Yellow skins, irregular and honest, stacked in barrels that seemed to multiply faster than he could count. The work was not punishment, it was arithmetic. A day's labour equalled 80 cents in camp scrip, the promise of coffee, cigarettes, or a sheet of paper. The men worked in crews of 20, each with a guard who looked less like a jailer than a foreman. The rifles slung across American shoulders were mostly for ceremony. The real discipline came from the barrels themselves. A farmer wanted them filled, the bureau wanted them tallied, and the prisoners wanted them done, because each barrel closed the gap between confinement and a sense of use. Franz learned the measure of a field faster than he had learned a life drawing. 1 acre, 200 barrels. A truck bed took 30. A day's crew could clear 10 acres if the soil was dry. He drew the figures on scraps of brown paper salvaged from feed sacks, a geometry of work that pleased him in ways he did not at first confess. War had taught him how numbers meant shells and calories, deficits and deaths. Here they meant potatoes, barrels and nickels. He preferred the Maine kind of math. The farmers watched with a mixture of suspicion and relief. Aroostook County's young men were gone to the war, their fathers too old to bend so long over rows, their wives and daughters weary from doing double. German hands, even enemy hands, meant the harvest came in before the frost killed it. A woman in a red scarf, seeing Franz stack barrels with a certain precision, said to no one in particular, "At least they know how to work." He pretended not to hear, but the words rooted themselves like the crop they lifted. At noon, the guards handed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Ham, mustard, lettuce crisp as if grown only for prisoners. Franz sat on an overturned barrel, unwrapped the sandwich slowly, and stared at the pale American bread. He ate half, saved the other half in his coat pocket. That night, back at Camp Houlton, he shared it with a bunkmate from Bremen, whose cough had deepened with the cold. Generosity had its own arithmetic, less exact, but equally binding. Inside the camp, winter settled like a curtain. The barracks were heated by stoves that gulped coal as if it were infinite. Franz noticed this too. In Austria, coal had become an object of barter, precious as tobacco. Here, it burned in stoves that never cooled, guards shoveling more without counting. Waste, abundance, plenty. These words kept circling back to him, like brush strokes layered on a canvas until they formed a truth. Evenings belonged to script. The PX opened at 6, its shelves stacked with Hershey bars, Lucky Strikes, Lifebuoy soap, and writing pads. Franz queued with the others, waiting for his turn to push chits across the counter. 1 day's harvest bought a chocolate bar and 2 sheets of paper. 3 days' labour bought a fountain pen cheap enough to leak but good enough to make marks that lasted. He chose the pen. Chocolate was gone in a mouthful. Ink lingered. He wrote letters that balanced truth with censorship. "We are well fed," he wrote to his mother. True. We work in fields, which I find useful. Also true. The winter is cold, but we are warm. True again. What he did not write was how the sight of a shelf lined with candy bars, available for nothing more than sweat and chits, gnawed at his sense of proportion. He wanted her to believe he was enduring hardship with courage. He could not confess that America's casual plenty was its own kind of weapon. The guards, many scarcely older than the prisoners, spoke little German. Franz taught himself phrases of English by listening. Barrel count, truckload, lunch break. The words fit into his ear with stubborn angles, but they stayed. He wrote them in his sketchbook like vocabulary from an art lecture. One guard, a farm boy from Bangor, drew pictures in the dirt with a stick to make himself clear. Franz responded in kind, the two of them constructing a fragile language out of lines. There were rules. No contact with civilians beyond the field, no wandering from the truck path, no fraternization, yet rules bent under the weight of daily need. Farmers slipped apples into coat pockets. Children dared to wave. One boy, perhaps 12, asked in slow English if the prisoners had names. Franz smiled, tapped his chest, and said, "Bacher." The boy repeated it carefully, as if pronouncing a secret. For a moment, wire and uniforms dissolved into syllables shared across a field. Back in the barracks, camaraderie grew in the spaces between work and sleep. The men carved chess pieces from potato wood, played endless games on boards sketched in pencil. They sang quietly, not the martial anthems of a Reich collapsing half a world away, but folk songs that had nothing to do with borders. Franz sketched faces by lamplight, tired faces, hopeful faces, faces that looked older than their years. In each drawing, he searched for the thing that captivity could not erase. Winter deepened, snow fell, and the fields vanished beneath a white sheet that muffled sound and softened the wire's sharpness. Work shifted indoors, cutting firewood, repairing barracks, clearing runways. The arithmetic of scrip continued. Franz bought more paper, more ink. He wrote not only letters but essays, reflections on abundance, on labour, on what it meant to be both prisoner and participant in a system that functioned better than anything he had known in freedom. He realized, with a clarity that startled him, that the potatoes mattered more than the barbed wire. The fields gave him purpose, the PX gave him agency, the stove gave him warmth. Captivity, paradoxically, offered a form of stability the Reich had long since squandered. He was a prisoner, yes, but also a worker, a writer, an observer of a world that seemed to run on rules not of fear, but of supply, demand, and fairness counted out in nickels. By January, the rhythm was set. Work, scrip, PX, letters, chess, sleep. War raged elsewhere, but here in Maine, the front lines were rows of potatoes already stored, barrels stacked against barns, snow piled high against barracks' walls. Franz marked the days in sketches. A tree against snow, a lamp's glow, a guard's profile blurred by frost. The drawings were small, but they measured survival in lines no censor could erase. And so winter passed, not as captivity, but as a kind of apprenticeship. Franz learned how potatoes fed more than hunger, how nickels bought dignity, how fields could matter more than fences. He did not yet know what spring would bring, only that when it came he would be ready to measure it, by barrels, by words, by sketches, by the quiet arithmetic of a life remade in Maine. When the thaw came, it did not creep but cracked. In March, the snowdrifts around the wire fence melted into rivulets that carried twigs and scraps of paper across the camp's gravel lanes. The ground smelled of wet earth and pine. Franz Bacher stood outside the barracks and drew the first buds he had seen in months. They were small, nearly invisible, but in his sketchbook they became a declaration. Spring had arrived, and with it a new season of life behind wire. The potatoes were gone to storage. Instead, new routines emerged: repairs, cleaning, training for the work to come. Franz welcomed the change, for it meant more time indoors with books, paper, and the camp library that had become his true classroom. What began with a fountain pen and scraps of feed-sack paper was now a discipline. He wrote every day, balancing his labour in the fields with labour in ink. The Houlton camp library was not grand, a converted storeroom lined with shelves built by the prisoners themselves. Yet to Franz, it was as rich as Vienna's museums. The volumes were donated by local townspeople and supplemented by the YMCA War Prisoners' Aid Programme. English primers sat beside Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. There were atlases, encyclopedias, old issues of Life magazine, even a stack of pulp westerns whose covers promised more action than their faded pages delivered. Franz signed out an English grammar and worked through it methodically, underlining sentences and copying words into a notebook. He found pleasure in the symmetry of grammar charts, the way verbs conjugated with mechanical certainty. His training as an art student had taught him to see proportion. Now he applied the same patience to language. Each new word was a brushstroke on a canvas of comprehension. The Americans encouraged it. Guards who knew a little German would trade words, pointing to tools or foods and giving names. Hammer, one said, holding it up. Kartoffel, Franz replied, and both laughed. These exchanges mattered more than either admitted. They bridged the gulf between enemy and human. Letters became lifelines, both for those who wrote them and those who waited. Prisoners were permitted 2 letters and 4 postcards each month, written in German but censored by American officers. Franz composed his carefully. He described work, weather, food, and always reassured his mother that he was healthy. He left out the contradictions, the abundance of coal, the shelves of chocolate, the sense that he was safer here than she was in bombed Vienna. One spring day he received a reply, the paper thin and grey, its lines crowded with her careful script. She wrote of shortages, of bread rations cut again, of nights spent in cellars as the RAF passed overhead. She asked whether he was warm, whether he prayed, whether he still drew. He pressed the letter to his chest before folding it away. That night, by lamplight, he sketched her face from memory, softer now, more lined, but still the anchor of his world. Some prisoners received no letters at all. Their families were gone, displaced, or silent under the rubble. These men gathered around those who did receive mail, listening hungrily to words meant for others. Franz learned to read aloud without breaking, giving the sentences a neutral tone that masked the ache inside. In return, men shared their food, their scrip, their company. Letters built a community of borrowed hope. Spring brought an official expansion of the camp's education program. The US government, influenced by the Geneva Conventions, permitted prisoners to organize classes, provided they remained under supervision. At Houlton, the barracks transformed into makeshift classrooms. Blackboards were scavenged from storage, chalk distributed sparingly, and volunteer teachers, former professors, engineers, students, stepped forward. Franz enrolled in English, mathematics, and even a lecture series on American government. He did not confess it, but democracy fascinated him. The notion that power came from ballots rather than decrees seemed at once naive and profound. He filled pages with notes, not because he expected to use them soon, but because they represented a different way of imagining order. He also taught. When word spread of his art training, men asked him to show them how to draw. He began with basics: line, proportion, shading. They drew potatoes, boots, each other's faces. For an hour each evening, the barracks was silent except for the scratch of pencils. Franz discovered that teaching steadied him. Instructing others reminded him that knowledge multiplied when shared, unlike rations that diminished. Yet not everything in camp was harmony. There were fractures, loyalties carried from the Reich that clashed with the new world inside the wire. Some prisoners remained fiercely Nazi, policing others for signs of weakness or sympathy toward Americans. They whispered threats, marked bunk boards, spread suspicion. The camp commandant tolerated none of it. Agitators were moved to stricter facilities. But before they left their mark. Franz encountered it one evening when he found a crude swastika carved onto his sketchbook cover. He recognized the message. His lessons, his letters, his attempts at English were suspect. To some, he was betraying loyalty by embracing the enemy's language. He closed the book, said nothing, and continued drawing. Silence was its own defiance. Among the prisoners, quiet alliances formed. Those who valued learning, those who wrote letters of truth rather than propaganda, those who saw the guards as men rather than faceless jailers. These men gravitated together. They played chess, traded books, shared food. They called themselves, half-jokingly, Die Kartoffelgesellschaft, the Potato Society, because they had first bonded over long days in the fields. Loyalty shifted from Reich to camp, from ideology to survival. Work resumed in the fields once the ground dried. Planting season demanded as much sweat as harvest, and again the scrip accumulated. Franz had become adept at stretching it. 1 week's labour purchased soap, writing paper, and the occasional indulgence of a Hershey bar. He measured value not only in goods, but in what they represented. Soap meant dignity, paper meant memory, chocolate meant a taste of joy. Each purchase affirmed that he was more than a number in a ledger. The Americans kept records too. Payroll logs noted hours, barrels, acres. To them, the POWs were not enemies so much as labour statistics. Franz noticed this and marvelled. In a system built on bureaucracy rather than hatred, even prisoners could find a place. He wondered what Austria might have become if its leaders had measured worth in barrels and fields rather than in blood and conquest. By May, the fields of Aroostook shimmered with green shoots. The war in Europe was turning, though news reached them only in fragments. A guard mentioned the Russians in Berlin. Another whispered that Hitler was dead. Rumours passed like wind, carrying both relief and dread. What would peace mean for prisoners? Release? Repatriation? Or some long limbo in a foreign land? Franz did not know. He only knew that the fields awaited, that his notebook filled daily, that loyalty now meant caring for the man coughing in the bunk beside him, or the boy from Bremen who feared he would never see home. He measured life not in years or ideology, but in the rhythm of planting, harvesting, writing, teaching. Spring had taught him that captivity could contain more freedom than the Reich ever allowed. The fields, the library, the letters, these were not chains but channels through which he rebuilt himself. The irony was sharp, almost cruel, that war had brought him across an ocean only to deliver him to a place where he could learn, grow, and even hope. And so, as the buds opened fully into leaves and the soil warmed beneath Maine's sun, Franz Bacher looked past the wire and saw not a boundary but a horizon. The war would end soon. But already, behind the fences of Camp Houlton, something inside him had ended. The illusion of loyalty to a Reich that had promised greatness and delivered rubble. In its place grew new roots, fragile but real, in fields of potatoes and in pages of ink. The first whisper came not from an official bulletin, but from a guard's radio. On May 2nd, 1945, the prisoners of Camp Houlton noticed that the guards carried themselves differently, lighter, almost careless. Rumours rippled through the barracks. Berlin had fallen. By May 7th, the whispers solidified into truth. The Reich had surrendered. Europe's war was over. For the Americans, it meant celebrations, flags unfurled, and victory parades in town. For the prisoners behind wire, it meant something stranger, a sudden collapse of the world they had belonged to, however unwillingly. Franz Bacher, the Austrian art student turned soldier, sat on his bunk with a stub of pencil and tried to draw the word Frieden, peace, over and over. Each time he shaded the letters, they felt hollow. Peace for whom? Victory for whom? For him, it meant uncertainty. The camp commandant assembled the prisoners on the parade ground. Rows of men in Feldgrau stood stiffly as the announcement was translated into German. Germany has unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe is over. You are prisoners of the United States until further instructions. The words hung heavy. Some men cheered softly, glad simply to survive. Others scowled, clinging to a loyalty that had nowhere left to anchor. A few wept openly. Franz remained still. He felt relief. His mother in Vienna might live through the bombing now, but also a deep unease. The Reich had collapsed, yet he stood in uniform, still labelled its soldier. Was he liberated or defeated? The paradox settled in his stomach like a stone. The letters that followed in May and June revealed more than official speeches. Franz's mother wrote again, her words heavy with both joy and despair. Vienna was in ruins, divided among occupiers. Food was scarcer than ever. But the war was over, she reminded him, and he should hold hope. She enclosed a tiny drawing of their old apartment building, half its windows shattered, but still standing. Franz traced the pencil lines with his finger until they blurred. Some prisoners received no word. Families displaced by the Red Army vanished into silence. For them, Victory Day was another wound. Men lined up at the mailroom with anxious eyes, and those who left empty-handed carried a grief heavier than any battlefield loss. Franz shared his letters, letting others read his mother's careful script aloud, so they might borrow hope second-hand. In the weeks after VE Day, life in camp took on an odd duality. For the first time, the guards relaxed. Fences seemed less forbidding. Rumours spread of prisoners being released in other states, sent home in waves. Yet at the same time, the fields of Maine demanded labour more than ever. Potato planting season coincided with the war's end, and Maine farmers, exhausted by years of labour shortages, needed every hand. Franz and his comrades still marched out to the fields at dawn, hoes slung over shoulders, guarded by men who no longer saw them as enemies but as workers. Pay still came, 80 cents in scrip for a day's labour, and the PX still offered chocolate, razor blades and stationery. Yet every evening the prisoners returned not to freedom, but to barracks under lock. It was the paradox of victory, abundance alongside captivity. They were no longer at war, but not yet free. With surrender came arguments. In the barracks, prisoners debated loudly over what loyalty meant now. A handful of diehards muttered that Germany would rise again, that Hitler lived in secret, that this was only a pause. Others scoffed, weary of delusion. Franz found himself in the middle. He had no desire to defend a Reich that had destroyed Vienna and left his family hungry, but nor could he yet embrace the Americans as saviours. He felt pulled in two directions, loyalty to memory and loyalty to survival. The camp chaplain, an American Lutheran, organised discussion groups. He offered Bibles, hymnals, and long talks about reconciliation. Some prisoners embraced it eagerly, others resisted, suspicious of propaganda. Franz attended once, listened quietly, and left with mixed feelings. Faith did not answer the arithmetic of his life. Potatoes planted, letters counted, scrip spent, days tallied. Just as the war in Europe ended, news arrived that the Pacific War raged on. Japan still fought. Some guards told prisoners that they might be sent west, even to labour in camps nearer to the Pacific coast. Franz pictured it. Another ocean, another set of fences, another indefinite wait. Instead, the summer stretched into routine. They remained in Maine, sowing potatoes beneath the long northern sun, while headlines shouted of Okinawa, atomic bombs, and surrender negotiations thousands of miles away. On August 15th, the loudspeakers crackled again. Japan had surrendered. The Second World War was over. For the first time since Doningfeldgrau, Franz Bacher was no longer a soldier of a nation at war. He was something stranger, a man without a country, a prisoner of a peace he had not yet tasted. The Americans celebrated again. Fireworks in town, parades, radios playing Glenn Miller. But for the prisoners, the moment was muted. Freedom was promised but delayed. Bureaucracy, transportation, and politics determined their fates. Some might be released within months, others held until 1946. Nobody knew. Meanwhile, work continued. In the fields, Franz bent over rows of potatoes as if nothing had changed. Sweat stung his eyes, and he remembered his mother's words. Survive. That is enough. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps planting potatoes in Maine was survival enough until the world decided what to do with him. Through it all, Franz's sketchbook filled. He drew the faces of his comrades, the outline of guard towers, the curve of potato blossoms, the sloping roofs of barns. He even sketched the American flag that flew above camp, studying its stars and stripes, not as politics, but as form. Each page was a record of days both ordinary and historic. In the absence of certainty, art became memory. He noticed how his style changed. Early drawings were harsh, angular, shaded in heavy strokes. By summer 1945, his lines softened, curves replacing corners. Hope had entered his hand before it entered his heart. By late August, camp officials announced that repatriation would begin soon. Trains would carry prisoners south to ports where ships waited. But soon was vague. Days stretched, each one marked by rumours. A transport tomorrow, a list being prepared, names checked. Some men packed belongings repeatedly, only to unpack again. The waiting gnawed at them more than barbed wire ever had. Franz kept working, teaching art, writing letters, drawing. He told himself that every day planted was one closer to harvest, every page filled one closer to release. Yet at night he lay awake listening to the wind through pine trees and wondered. When he returned to Austria, what would be left? A mother in ruins, a country divided, a future uncertain. Sometimes captivity felt safer than freedom. Victory had ended the war, but defeat still clung to the prisoners. The word Kriegsgefangene, prisoner of war, still defined them. They were no longer soldiers, no longer enemies, but not yet men restored. The shadow of defeat stretched across every barracks bed, every letter unopened, every rumour unanswered. Franz looked around the camp one evening in September. The setting sun turned the barbed wire to fire, the potato fields beyond glowing gold. He realized that his life had split in two, before America and after America. Whatever came next, whether in Vienna or elsewhere, would carry the imprint of this place. The fields, the books, the sketches, the contradictions of victory behind fences. The war had ended. The Reich was gone. The world had shifted. Yet for Franz Bacher, the summer of 1945 was less a conclusion than a limbo. Victory belonged to others. Defeat belonged to him and his comrades. In between lay survival, potatoes planted, letters written, sketches made. And so he waited, patiently, painfully, for the moment when the gates would open and the fields of Maine would be memory rather than present. Until then he lived in the shadow of victory, learning that even peace could feel like captivity. The announcement came with the crispness of Maine's autumn air. One morning in October 1945, the camp loudspeakers summoned Company Bacher and dozens of others to assembly. A list was read, names clipped off one by one. These men, the officer declared, would begin repatriation. At last, the gates that had held Franz in for over a year would open. But the word homecoming was deceptive. For Franz Bacher, Home was no longer Vienna as he remembered it. It was rubble and rations, ruins and uncertainty. Going home meant stepping into a country that barely existed, under the occupation of four powers, with borders redrawn and futures unclear. In those last days at Camp Houlton, the prisoners walked the familiar paths with strange affection. They said goodbye to the potato fields they had worked in every season. They touched the rough boards of their barracks as if to imprint the place into memory. For all its fences and towers, the camp had given them food, work, letters, and survival. In its odd way, it had been safer than the world awaiting them. Franz packed his sketches, letters, and the scrip he had never spent. He drew one final picture, the silhouette of a guard tower against a Maine sunset. He tucked it into the back of his notebook, a memory of captivity that was also a memory of life preserved. On October 20th, a train carried them south. As it pulled away from Houlton, prisoners pressed their faces to the windows. Pine forests blurred past. Local townspeople gathered at crossings, some waving, others staring in silence. For the prisoners, it was the last glimpse of an America that had been both captor and caretaker. The train wound its way through New England, then down toward the ports. At each stop, American civilians watched curiously. Some offered food, apples, candy bars, sandwiches, passed through the windows. Franz remembered a girl of perhaps 12 pressing a Hershey bar into his hand. He almost refused, ashamed to accept a child's gift, but her smile left him no choice. He split it with his comrades, savouring the taste of sweetness against the bitterness of departure. They crossed cities they had only read about in newspapers: New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. For a boy from Vienna, each skyline was both overwhelming and fleeting. He thought about how far he had travelled, from art school to uniform, from Europe to Maine, and now across the breadth of America. Yet always as a prisoner, never as a free man. At Newport News, Virginia, they boarded a Liberty ship refitted for prisoner transport. Its decks reeked of salt, oil, and humanity. Hundreds of men were crammed into bunks stacked 4 high, hammocks swaying with the Atlantic's roll. The journey eastward was nothing like the one west. When Franz had crossed the ocean in 1944, he had been guarded tightly, his fate unknown. Now, in late 1945, the tension was gone. The guards were perfunctory, even friendly. The war was over. These were no longer enemies, just passengers going home. On deck, Franz sketched the sea. He drew the endless horizon, the gulls that followed for scraps, the waves crashing against the bow. He tried to capture the feeling of transition, of a life suspended between captivity and freedom. The Atlantic stretched on for weeks, time measured by meals of canned meat and the rhythm of waves. Men played cards, sang songs, argued about what awaited them. Some dreamed aloud of reunions with wives or sweethearts. Others worried their families were gone. Franz said little, preferring to draw and listen. By November, land appeared, the grey outline of France, battered yet familiar. At Le Havre, the prisoners disembarked into a Europe they scarcely recognised. The harbour was shattered, cranes bent, warehouses burned out. Yet crowds of French civilians gathered to watch, some shouting insults, others simply curious. For the first time, Franz felt the weight of defeat publicly. In America, he had been a prisoner in anonymity. Here, in Europe, he was a German uniform returning to a continent his army had ravaged. Trains carried them across France and into the American zone of Germany. The journey revealed devastation mile after mile. Villages flattened, bridges collapsed, rail lines twisted. Smoke still rose from ruins months after surrender. Franz sketched what he saw, unable to look without recording. Entire cities reduced to skeletons of stone, children picking through rubble, women carrying buckets from wells where plumbing no longer existed. It was a homecoming into a graveyard. At a transit camp near Heidelberg, the POWs were processed. They were fingerprinted, questioned, photographed. Some were held longer for suspicion of war crimes. Others were released within days. Franz, who had been nothing more than a private and a reluctant one at that, passed quickly. He was issued temporary papers identifying him as a displaced person until Austria established its civilian administration. Here, he faced another paradox. He was Austrian, not German, yet the Allies treated him as part of the Wehrmacht. Austria, technically liberated, was under Allied occupation. Vienna itself was divided into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. His future depended on which side of the city his family lived in, and whether he could reach them. By early 1946, arrangements were made. Trucks and trains carried Austrian prisoners toward their homeland. Crossing into Austria was surreal: alpine valleys scarred by bombing, towns starved by shortages, yet the mountains unchanged, eternal. Snow covered the rooftops as the convoy rolled into Vienna. The city was both familiar and alien. Franz walked streets where he had once carried sketchbooks, now reduced to rubble piles. The Ringstrasse still curved grandly, but many of its buildings stood gutted. Soviet soldiers patrolled with rifles slung, their presence heavy and suspicious. Black markets thrived at every corner. Hunger was constant, relief uneven. He found his mother in their old apartment block, walls cracked, windows patched with cardboard. She was thinner, her hair grey, but her embrace was fierce. They wept in silence, words unnecessary. She had survived. So had he. That was enough. Rebuilding began slowly. Food came from ration cards: bread, potatoes, powdered milk. Clothing was patched, shoes repaired with scraps. Franz searched for work, first in clean-up crews clearing rubble, later in offices run by the new Austrian administration. But what defined his days most was art. He sketched the ruins, the faces of survivors, the Soviet tanks rumbling down boulevards. His wartime notebooks, filled in Maine, became a bridge, proof that even in captivity he had not ceased to see, to create. Yet he carried Camp Houlton within him. He spoke of potatoes and pine trees, of American guards who had treated him with decency, of books and classes that had sustained him. He told his mother about the paradox of victory behind fences, how he had discovered that survival could grow even in captivity. In Vienna's ruins, those lessons mattered more than ever. Going home was not triumph, but transition. Franz Bacher had left Austria as a soldier of a regime that no longer existed, and returned as a displaced person in a broken land. Home was still there, but altered beyond recognition. Freedom meant hunger, rebuilding, and uncertainty. Yet within that uncertainty lay possibility. Looking back, Franz realized that Maine, with its potato fields and barracks, had prepared him for this. The arithmetic of scrip and rations, the patience of waiting for letters, the endurance of barbed wire, all had taught him how to survive scarcity and rebuild from ruins. Homecoming was not the end of captivity, but its continuation in another form. Only slowly, through work and art, would he learn to transform defeat into life. The war was over, but its shadow lingered in every street Franz Bacher walked. Vienna in 1946 was a city of echoes, echoes of artillery that had shattered its districts, echoes of boots on cobblestones, echoes of loss in every family. Yet it was also a city of beginnings. For Franz, returning from captivity in Maine, rebuilding meant not only bricks and rations but memory, how to carry the past without being crushed by it. In the first months after his return, Franz joined a Trümmerkommando, the rubble-clearing brigades of Vienna. Every day he and hundreds of others pulled bricks from heaps of debris, stacking those that could be reused. Women, men, even children worked together with carts, shovels, and bare hands. The rhythm was monotonous, but it restored fragments of the city, wall by wall. Franz filled his pockets with broken bits of stone to sketch during breaks. He drew women carrying buckets, children with hollow eyes, men bent under sacks of plaster. These sketches, smudged with dust, became his first record of Austria's rebirth. The work was brutal but communal. Prisoners of war like him, civilians, widows, even priests laboured side by side. No one asked about uniforms anymore. The question was not which side one had fought on, but whether one could carry another stone. Hunger was a constant undertone. Rations amounted to little more than 1,200 calories a day, often less. Bread was mixed with sawdust flour, potatoes stretched every meal, and meat was a memory. Franz remembered Maine with bitter irony. In captivity he had eaten better than he did now, free in Vienna. He recalled US camp rations, potatoes, canned beef, even chocolate from the PX. Now he bartered sketches for eggs, portraits for bread, small paintings for cigarettes that could be exchanged on the black market. The Marshall Plan had not yet touched daily life, but American food aid was trickling in. Franz queued for care packages distributed through relief agencies. Sometimes he received tins of Spam or powdered milk, the same flavours he had tasted behind barbed wire in Houlton. The continuity unsettled him, captivity and freedom both fed by the same distant nation. Even as survival consumed his days, Franz sought ways back to art. He presented himself at the Academy of Fine Arts, the same institution that had rejected another Austrian named Adolf Hitler decades earlier. The academy had suffered war damage but reopened with makeshift classes. Professors urged students to document reality, ruins, hardship, the human face of survival. Franz's notebooks from Maine, filled with sketches of camp life, drew astonishment. They were proof that even a prisoner had kept his eye sharp and his hand steady. He enrolled again, though money was scarce. Tuition was often paid in labour, painting murals on rebuilt schools, sketching plans for reconstruction projects, illustrating textbooks. Franz discovered that art, once a personal passion, now had civic urgency. His sketches were not just practice, they were testimony. Among his classmates, Franz's stories set him apart. While others spoke of the Eastern Front, of retreat, of bombings, he spoke of Maine, pine forests, potato rows, scrip and PX rules, baseball games watched from behind wire. He described Americans who gave prisoners books, guards who looked the other way when a sketchpad was passed through a fence. Some classmates listened with envy, others with skepticism. "You were lucky," one said. "Better to have been a prisoner in America than free in Vienna." Franz could not argue. Yet the memory was double-edged. He felt a guilt he could not voice. He had survived the war with more food, more shelter, and more education than many civilians at home. He had come back stronger while others had starved. His sketches from Maine were both treasure and burden. From Camp Houlton, he had written letters home. Now he waited for answers that never came. Postal systems were shattered, addresses erased by bombs. Months later, he received a bundle of forwarded letters, his own, returned with stamps reading, "Undeliverable." In the margins of those unopened envelopes, he began sketching faces he imagined. Friends gone, neighbours scattered. The silence of correspondence became part of his art. One letter did arrive, from an American guard at Camp Houlton who had befriended him over books. "I hope you are free now," it read. Enclosed was a photograph of Maine fields under snow. Franz stared at it for hours. The image of America, a land of plenty, contrasted too sharply with the ruins outside his window. It became a talisman, a reminder that another world existed, one where barns stood whole and food grew in abundance. By 1947, Vienna had settled into uneasy occupation. Soviet patrols stalked one district, Americans another. Black markets flourished at the seams between zones. Franz sketched soldiers at checkpoints, their weapons incongruous against barrows of potatoes and pushcarts of coal. The city felt less like a capital than a chessboard divided by foreign hands. Yet life continued. Theatres reopened, trams rattled again, and children played in rubble like it was their natural playground. Franz found occasional commissions illustrating pamphlets for relief agencies. They wanted images of children smiling with food parcels, of reconstruction projects rising. He complied, but in his private notebooks he drew the other side, the thin faces in ration lines, the scars on buildings and bodies alike. His art became a dialogue between what was shown and what was hidden. By the end of the decade, Franz faced choices. Some of his fellow returnees emigrated: Canada, Australia, even America. They had seen abundance overseas and wanted no part of Europe's ruins. Franz considered it, especially when he received another letter from his American Guard friend, inviting him to study art in the United States under new exchange programs. But he declined. He felt tied to Vienna, to the rubble he was sketching, to the city that had shaped him in suffering as much as in beauty. Instead, he resolved to make his art a record of survival. He began preparing a portfolio he called Captivity and Ruins, half drawn in Maine, half in Vienna. His professors urged him to publish. He hesitated, fearing it would seem boastful. But privately he believed that someday, when people asked what the war had done to men like him, his sketches would answer. Rebuilding was not just about clearing bricks or receiving aid. For Franz, it meant learning how to hold two worlds together: the abundance of Maine and the scarcity of Vienna, the memory of captivity and the challenge of freedom. He came to understand that survival was not only measured by calories or rations, but by the ability to remember, to create, to bear witness. As the 1940s closed, Vienna still bore its wounds. But Franz Bacher, the Austrian art student who had once marched into war in Feldgrau, had begun to stitch together a future. Not a triumphant one, not even a secure one, but a life rebuilt from memory, stone by stone, line by line, sketch by sketch. By 1950, Vienna no longer resembled the shattered city Franz had returned to in 1946. Streets were cleared, shops reopened, and new facades covered the scars of shellfire. Yet beneath the surface, memory lingered like an undertow. For Franz Bacher, the decade marked the slow shift from survival to purpose. He had lived through soldiering, captivity, and hunger. Now he had to discover how to live as an artist in a country redefining itself between past guilt and future promise. Austria's Second Republic was rebuilding not only buildings, but identity. The 1955 State Treaty finally ended Allied occupation, returning sovereignty after a decade of division. Propaganda emphasized Austria as Hitler's first victim, a narrative that eased collective shame. But for returnees like Franz, who had worn Feldgrau willingly, the simplification felt hollow. He had seen too much, drawn too much, to believe Austria innocent. His sketchbooks carried reminders: barbed wire, POW barracks, empty potato fields, Vienna children scavenging for coal. Still, the public mood demanded optimism. Newspapers printed photographs of Marshall Plan shipments, sacks of grain, crates of milk powder, tractors arriving from America. Franz sometimes saw his own drawings in these reports, illustrations commissioned by aid agencies eager to portray hope. He accepted the work, it paid rent, but privately he wondered if art should comfort or confront. In 1952, Franz rented a small loft near the Naschmarkt. The building still bore war damage, with plaster peeling and one corner propped by wooden beams, but the skylight flooded the room with light. He filled it with easels, canvases, and stacks of sketchbooks rescued from Maine and post-war Vienna. The studio smelled of turpentine and damp stone. Visitors said it felt both sanctuary and archive. Here he experimented with styles. Some canvases depicted cityscapes in muted greys, outlines of ruined churches against pale skies. Others drew directly from his camp sketches: Men bent over potato rows, guards with rifles silhouetted at dusk. Yet increasingly his work shifted from literal to symbolic. Barbed wire became abstract curves, ration cards turned into collages, faces rendered with haunting simplicity. Critics would later call his style memory realism, though Franz never coined labels. He simply painted what pressed against his mind. By the mid-1950s, Austria was hungry for art that symbolized renewal. Franz's work, raw and heavy with memory, did not always fit. Galleries preferred landscapes, still lifes, or optimistic scenes of alpine villages. His early exhibitions drew mixed reviews. Some hailed his authenticity, others dismissed him as a chronicler of pain. One critic wrote, "Herr Bacher paints with rubble dust. Admirable, but who wishes to hang ruins in their parlour?" Yet survivors and intellectuals found resonance. At a 1956 exhibition in Vienna's Künstlerhaus, his series Captivity and Ruins drew crowds of students and veterans. One American visitor, a former officer who had served in Austria, recognized in the sketches scenes from Camp Houlton. "I never thought I'd see Maine in Vienna," he told Franz. That recognition carried weight. Franz realized his personal memory touched international history. Material life improved dramatically in the 1950s. Marshall Plan funds rebuilt factories, new apartment blocks rose, and consumer goods returned to shelves. For the first time since boyhood, Franz could buy fresh fruit, new clothes, even an American-made radio. He married in 1958, choosing Anna, a fellow artist who had lost her father at Stalingrad. Their wedding reception offered wine, bread, and music, not abundance, but dignity. The couple lived modestly but securely. Anna taught drawing at a local school, while Franz pursued exhibitions. They adopted the rhythm of post-war Austrian families. Ration lines gave way to grocery queues, coal fires to electric stoves. Yet beneath comfort, Franz felt uneasy. The abundance reminded him of America, of Maine fields and PX chocolate, while memories of hunger during Vienna's worst years never quite faded. He carried both extremes in his work. In 1962, Franz was invited to a US-Austrian cultural symposium. He travelled to Washington, D.C., then to New York, where he stood before skyscrapers taller than any cathedral he had ever seen. Yet the most emotional moment came when he visited Maine again, at the invitation of local historians preserving records of Camp Houlton. He walked once more among potato fields, this time without guards, without fences. The barns stood the same. The soil smelled familiar. Farmers who had once watched German POWs at work now greeted him as a guest. Some even remembered the camp scrip, the POW-issued tokens Franz had sketched. At the local library, he viewed photographs of prisoners harvesting potatoes, photographs in which he recognized his younger self in Feldgrau. The realization shook him. His memory was not just personal, it was recorded, archived, history itself. He began a new series of paintings upon returning to Vienna, titled The Edge of America, blending Maine landscapes with POW imagery. Barbed wire cut across pine forests. Potato rows turned into marching columns. Austrian critics found them puzzling, but American audiences later embraced them as unique bridges between histories. Back in Vienna, Franz began teaching at the Academy of Fine Arts in 1963. His lectures emphasized observation and honesty. He told students, "Do not paint what you wish were true. Paint what is." He showed them his wartime sketches, not to glorify, but to demonstrate discipline, drawing with a stub of pencil on camp paper, capturing truth even in captivity. Students admired his intensity, though some found him severe. Yet many later credited him with teaching them that art could be moral testimony as much as beauty. Anna and Franz collaborated on children's books, illustrating folk tales with delicate drawings. These projects softened his public image, but privately he continued darker work, portraits of POWs, of rubble women, of Vienna's scarred faces. He called them his hidden canvases, shown rarely but painted compulsively. By the late 1960s, Franz was no longer merely surviving. He was shaping Austrian memory. His art had become both personal catharsis and public witness. He stood at exhibitions beside younger artists who had not lived the war, and he realized that his generation's role was shifting, from participants to storytellers. He carried the weight of barbed wire and potato fields, of Maine and Vienna, of captivity and freedom, and he translated it into lines and colours. The ruins were mostly gone by then, covered by plaster and prosperity. But in Franz's canvases they remained, reminders that beneath every rebuilt wall lay memory, and that an Austrian art student who once crossed the ocean as a prisoner had chosen to rebuild life not by forgetting, but by drawing truth into permanence. By the 1970s, Franz Bacher had become something of an institution in Vienna's art scene. He was no longer the young prisoner sketching by candlelight or the hungry returnee searching for work among ruins. Instead, he was a professor, a painter with exhibitions across Europe, and a figure whose past as a POW in America was increasingly of interest to historians and journalists. The decades of silence about captivity began to break, and Franz found himself both witness and interpreter of a chapter many Austrians preferred to forget. The 1970s brought a new cultural climate. The victim narrative that had dominated Austrian politics after 1945, claiming Austria as Hitler's first conquest, was now under scrutiny. Younger generations asked uncomfortable questions. What had ordinary Austrians done during the war? How complicit had they been? University seminars debated responsibility. Plays and films challenged myths. In this context, Franz's POW story gained unexpected relevance. When invited to lecture on art and memory, he spoke openly about wearing feldgrau, about marching under swastika banners, and about the surreal contrast of harvesting potatoes in Maine while Europe burned. Students listened with rapt attention. For many, he was the first veteran they had heard speak without evasion or glorification. He insisted that his role was not heroic. I was not a resister, not a conspirator, not even a good soldier. I was an art student in uniform who ended up behind barbed wire. My duty now is to tell the truth without excuses. Franz's art began circulating more widely through cultural exchange programs. Exhibitions travelled to West Germany, France, and the United States. In 1975, a series of his Edge of America paintings hung in Boston, where veterans who had once guarded Camp Houlton came to see them. Some recognized landscapes, barns, even faces. One former GI, now grey-haired, told Franz, "You've painted what we never thought about, that you saw us as much as we saw you." That same year, Austrian television aired a documentary about German POWs in America. Franz appeared briefly, standing in his studio beside sketches of barracks and potato fields. His voiceover said, "The surprise was not captivity, but abundance. The shock was not defeat, but plenty." The line echoed widely, quoted in newspapers and history essays. To many Austrians, it encapsulated the contrast between European scarcity and American abundance during the war. Amid public recognition, Franz's private world remained modest. He and Anna continued living in the same apartment near the Naschmarkt, surrounded by shelves of books and canvases stacked against walls. They had no children, by choice, they said, but their home was always full of students, nieces, and young artists. Dinners were simple: bread, cheese, and wine, served around a table scarred with paint stains. Friends recalled Franz's dry humour, his fondness for telling stories of Maine winters, and his habit of sketching on napkins, even in cafes. Anna provided balance. Where Franz carried heavy memories, she offered lightness. Her illustrations of fairy tales became beloved in Austrian schools, and she often teased him gently. Franz paints ruins, I paint castles. Yet she also defended him fiercely against critics who accused his work of being too bleak. "His ruins are not despair," she said. "They are truth. And truth has its own kind of hope." During the Cold War, Austria positioned itself as a neutral bridge between East and West. Conferences in Vienna attracted diplomats and intellectuals from both blocs. Franz found himself invited to panels on cultural memory, sometimes alongside former Soviet officers or American veterans. He marvelled at the irony, men who had once faced each other in battle now drinking coffee in the same hall. In 1980, at a symposium in Salzburg, he met Japanese scholars studying POW experiences. They were astonished by his descriptions of Maine. One remarked, "Our soldiers in Siberia starved." "You ate potatoes in America," Franz replied softly. "Yes, and I am alive because of that." The comparison haunted him, how geography determined survival, how captivity under different powers shaped entire generations. By the early 1980s, Austria began formally commemorating aspects of the war once left in silence. Universities organized exhibits on prisoners of war abroad. Franz's sketches were displayed at the Austrian National Library in 1983, under the title Gefangenschaft und Erinnerung, Captivity and Memory. Visitors were struck by the simplicity of his lines: men bent over shovels, barracks at dusk, the outline of barbed wire against sky. Critics praised their honesty, neither propaganda nor sentimentality, but lived witness. Franz, now in his 60s, received awards he had never sought: cultural medals, honorary positions. He accepted them politely, but insisted, "I am not a hero. I am simply someone who drew what he saw." What mattered to him was that younger Austrians looked at the drawings and asked questions. In 1985, veterans from both sides organized a reunion in Maine. Former American guards and German prisoners met on potato farms, now mechanized and prosperous. Franz travelled with Anna, carrying a folder of his camp sketches. He was embraced by farmers who remembered him, by families who had once seen German boys working their fields. Local newspapers covered the event with photographs: white-haired men shaking hands across decades, children playing where once there had been barbed wire. During the reunion, Franz walked alone to the edge of a potato field at dusk. He stood where in 1944 he had once dug furrows, a guard watching nearby. Now there was no fence, no uniform, only the wind across rows of green. He felt gratitude and melancholy intertwined. "Here," he whispered to himself, "I first learned what abundance meant." By the end of the 1980s, Franz's life had come full circle. From art student in Vienna to POW in Maine, from returnee amid ruins to professor of art and memory, he had witnessed Europe's descent and recovery. His paintings hung in museums, his testimony appeared in history books, but he remained at heart the young man with a pencil stub, drawing what he saw. As the decade closed, new challenges arose: illnesses of age, the political storms of Europe's shifting order, but Franz carried into them the same conviction that had guided him through captivity: that truth, once drawn, endures. His legacy was not simply survival, but the translation of memory into lines and colours, so that future generations might understand what it meant to measure life not only in freedom or captivity, but in potatoes, in barbed wire, and in the abundance that once seemed impossible.